Okay, so I got the go from that. Now we can get started. It's a tremendous pleasure to introduce today Barbara Tversky. I want to start by, instead of introducing her with all of her accolades, you need, of course, need to know that she's a professor of psychology at Stanford and at Columbia University. But I want you to think about something important that she has actually found out. So whenever you think, whenever you talk, or whenever you even think about, going from this building to another building, you're tracing in your mind a path, like now, gesture, right? This is the simple fact that she took notice a couple of years ago and started thinking about, could it be that we only think with our brain and with our mind, or we think with our body? And we start tracing paths beyond just the mind that we have, but start having something really abstract. So her entire research is to demonstrate that we are culminating this mind in motion. We are more than the head that hangs up. We are a body that really navigates the world. And she is able to show us that gestures are part of the thought, that the imagination is part of the thought, and not just the language that we have. And I want you to really, if there's one thing that you need to leave this room with, is with this simple observation that there is much more than language, than the thoughts in the world. And with that, I just want to, really thank her for coming all the way from New York to here, for giving us so many days, today, tomorrow, and also to all of you guys for coming today. We're going to have the reception afterwards, so if you want to then talk to her in more private and so on, so please feel free to reach out to her. She's a very lovely woman who would love to talk to you, to all of you. So thank you, Barbara, and yours.
Thank you, Lucia, for that kind introduction and for inviting me.
Just unmute the mic. So I think.
Oh, okay, here.
Sorry about that. Did you try again?
Okay, it's on. Yeah, now I can hear. Thank you, Lucia, for inviting me and for that kind introduction. It's just thrilling to be here to see these amazing groups of people all involved in mind-blowing research, and my head is expanding. And I see how the group is compartmentalized, but also focused. And I'm really excited to see what you find. So I'll stop talking about how wonderful you are and go on to my own talk. So all living things must move and act in space to survive. Children need to know how to get food into their mouth, eventually how to get home, or they will have to be taken care of all their lives. Even plants need to move toward the sun, away from wind. Even plants rooted in the ground. Even bacteria need to move to things that are nutritious, away from things that are noxious. So that's the first act in space. And it even happens at an intracellular level, that you move towards something that's beneficial and away from something that's noxious. The elementary act in space that all living things must be able to do. And that act of going towards something nutritious and away from something noxious is replete with emotion. So that's our beginnings long and long ago. So my argument is, as Lucia said, that all thought begins as spatial thought. It's not the entire edifice, but it is the foundation, and we'll see that in many different ways. So space is special. It's supramodal. We know about space not just from vision, from audition, from smell, from proprioception. We have multiple paths into our spatial knowledge. And blind people can navigate often quite better than I can. So although we think about space as visual, it's visual in those of us who can see, but it's spatial in those who can't. It's essential to survival. It evolved long before language. It occupies arguably half the cortex. It's, as I said, the basis for other knowledge. Our knowledge of space is not like geometry or physical measurement. It's not measured, it's not accurate, it's biased and distorted by our perception of space and our action in space, which are interrelated. So we use space and the things in it, that's how I think about space, to think, communicate, and create. So I'll show you, that's a big agenda. So I'll show you some of that today. And it parallels a bit my research life of first looking at how we get the world into our minds, objects, spaces, bodies. And then after I sort of worked in each of those areas, I thought about, well, we're using space to think, we're putting our minds in the world. And how are we putting our minds in the world? So I studied first the spaces of action, the space around the body, which is distorted by the importance of the body parts, just like your homunculus on the sensory motor cortex. We looked at the space around the body and reach of eye or mind, and that is distorted to some extent by our body axes. Front, back seems to have greater importance, and up, down, and left, right, less so. So that's a whole set of studies I won't be able to talk about. We also looked at the space of exploration, the space that's too big to be seen from a single viewpoint, and we put together from many different experiences. And what's special about that for humans is we use not only our own exploration, but we could use people's descriptions of space. We get lost. People tell us where to go, or we read instructions before we go. Maps, making maps. So we have multiple ways of getting in, of understanding the space around us. And again, it's distorted in a number of ways that I won't be able to talk about now. Then the spaces we create to enhance our bodies and minds, we create maps, charts, diagrams, and we'll talk about that. Sketches, I will talk about that. But we're also creating social spaces like this one. We're constantly designing them, your spaces in your home, and then these larger spaces out in the world that both constrain motion and enable motion. Okay, so again, the audacious claim is spatial thinking is the foundation of thought, but to use a spatial metaphor, not the entire edifice, but the foundation. And I'll show you that in several domains, brain, and I'm a little embarrassed to talk about brain with this amazing group here that knows far and has extended that knowledge. Language, gesture, and graphics. So I will concentrate on gesture and graphics, but the work on brain really gives the greatest support for spatial thinking being the foundation of thought. And as many as you know, John O'Keefe and his group at UCL discovered long ago put single electrodes in the brains of rodents and looked at how they fired as the rats ran around an open space, and they found there were single neurons that responded to places. So every time the rat was in a particular place, that neuron would go off. But those neurons weren't spatially arrayed. So although they called their book the hippocampus as the cognitive map, it wasn't really a map. And the map part, my understanding is the Mosher's working in John O'Keefe's lab discovered one synapse away in entorhinal cortex, grid cells that did arrange the place cells in a map-like array. The newspapers presented it as a GPS, but it isn't quite accurate. And either the newspapers or the maps, and they are distorted by reward systems and so forth. And later work, and some of that is being done right here, showed that those single cells in hippocampus in humans are active for not just places, but people in social networks and concepts and conceptual networks, times and event networks, and that the grid cells array them in a kind of two-dimensional space. So our abstract knowledge of conceptual knowledge gets bootstrapped by these same structures that in rodents and bats and other creatures map space. So that again is pretty solid evidence, I think, that spatial cognition is the basis of, or a basis of thought. That, okay. So language, and I'm gonna finish with the neural language. Think of the way we talk, and I think we're not aware of how much of our language is spatial. Again, I'm just gonna bring highlights. And people walk and people use their hands, and those get mapped onto different kinds of ideas. So our feet get mapped onto paths in the world, and we talk about thinking as one thought leads to another, as if the thought was following a path the way our feet follow a path. And we can say about our thinking that it follows a straight path, it goes in circles, it zigzags, it wanders. We can think about going up, we can think, which is fighting gravity, so it takes resources. We can kick around thoughts, so that's a little bit like our hands, that the sorts of ways that we act on thought with our hands. So our hands can raise thoughts, they can toss them out, tear them apart, pull them together, line them up. We can reach for thoughts, grab them, rearrange them. The list goes on, and it's very hard to talk about action on thought without using the language of action on objects. So I know many of you speak many different languages, so run that through your languages, the languages I'm familiar with. On the whole, the only way to talk about actions on thought is to use the language of actions on objects. So thinking is a path that we follow with our feet, and ideas are objects that we act on the way we act on real objects. So there's more on figurative spaces. We can say we're out of depth at the top. Someone's at the top of the class. Someone's feeling up, and I'm using those gestures just as I did when I was talking about rearranging thought, tearing them apart. And often we all find ourselves or see those gestures being used when we're expressing those thoughts. You can fall into a depression, you can get closer with people or grow apart, you can think out of a box, you can open a field, you can think from a different perspective. And again, perspective is something we've worked on a lot that I won't have time to talk about, both in language and in life perspective. So the language of spatial thinking is everywhere for abstract thought, even concrete thought. So thought comes from actions in the world. Our minds go from thought to thought along relations, just as our feet go from place to place along paths, and our minds act on ideas just as our hands act on things. So I'm done with brain and language. The mind is too small. When thought overwhelms the mind puts thought into the world. And the main ways we put thought into the world is language, gesture, and graphics. Well, I've talked a great deal about language. I'm going to turn now to gesture and graphics. And the advantage of gesture and graphics for putting thought in the world is there are direct connections to meaning. So language is purely symbolic. You have to know what the words mean in each language that you encounter in order to understand it and use it. But you can point in any language. And that's the first gesture that children do is point, and they point before they speak. So they're already expressing thought in the world before they're speaking, and it's gestural. So gesture and graphics have more direct relation to meaning. When I say we've grown closer or grown far apart, I'm moving my hands closer or far apart. You don't need language to get that. Okay, gesture. These are borrowed from Susan Golden Meadows. She's the queen of gesture, but they're great. Babies pointing or looking puzzled. And that's here, and we have nice, peaceful gestures. So I'm going to show you now humans gesturing, and this is an extreme experiment. We put students alone in a room, and we task them with learning descriptions like this. So this went on for 3 screens. So they're having to learn it, and they're going to be tested. So these are students, they're good at learning. They're alone in a room. We have a camera on them, and I'll show you some. So they're reading descriptions. We started with environments. Etna's a charming town nestled in an attractive valley, entered on River Highway. River Highway runs east-west at the southern edge of the town of Etna, toward the eastern border, River Highway, etc. So it went on for several screens, and we have tested these environments in many situations. So we sort of know how they work. They had 4 or 8 landmarks that had to be remembered in relation to each other. This environment was told from an overview perspective using north, south, east, west. We also used environments that were told from or described from a route perspective. So left, right, you're walking here, turning here, left, right. People become good at going back and forth between them if they're exposed many times. Again, this is previous work. So we tested I'll first show you the video. So she, again, alone in a room, this is what she's doing as she studies. No one told her to do that. It's spontaneous. 70% of our participants do that spontaneously on at least one description they read for and learned for. So she's making lines for paths and points for places, just as you would if you were sketching out a map of the area. She's essentially making a map. She's doing it in pieces. She's reading, doing, and that's characteristic of our participants. They do it in parts and test themselves. So they're building a spatial model with their hands. This is, we used mechanical systems, which are purely visual. This is a car brake. So from the brake fluid reservoir, brake fluid enters and travels sideways and down the tube. As the brake fluid accumulates at the bottom of the tube, pressure is exerted on the small pistons and so forth. So they're learning the braking system from the description, no diagram. And again, these are descriptions that have been pre-tested by other people. So this is a particularly expressive guy, making big gestures. I think, he's congratulating himself. He got it. And you see he's repeating things over and over on the gestures, sometimes big, sometimes small. Embodying this, that's not a gesture, okay? So for the maps, we could code everything they were doing, the lines and the dots. And the original perspective made a difference in how much they did in lines and how much they did in dots. When we got to the car brake, we couldn't code every single gesture because people made them so differently. Some were very small, some on the table, some in the air. And again, this is characteristic. One more, this woman got schedules. So she's got essentially a matrix. It's three different schedules, and she's essentially making a matrix. She's looking at her hands a bit. You probably noticed that the other two weren't looking at their hands. And that's again characteristic. On the whole, they make these spatial models with their bodies without looking at them. It's not even leaving traces, but she's placing this matrix exactly so she wants to look. But we're arguing that the models are spatial motor models with their hands, and they help to create spatial motor or spatial models in the mind. And making a spatial model of complicated descriptions helps you learn. So the intervening is the gestures. The gestures are helping them learn. Okay, so the models I'm arguing are spatial motor diagrams. 50 to 70% make them spontaneously. Again, as depending on the maps elicit more, the car brake fewer, and the representations are direct, using elements and spatial relations between elements to abstract what they're learning, and making them improves learning. So those who made gesture maps, spatial motor maps with their hands performed better on the test. And those who made them for some descriptions, but not all, performed better on the descriptions that they made gestures. So that's it. It's not just that they spontaneously make these spatial motor maps, they actually help them to remember and comprehend. Okay, so gestures help social interactions too. This is a pair of students who have been tasked with, this was worked on at Stanford. They have a map of Stanford campus. Earthquakes are not uncommon there. And they in a hypothetical experiment, there's been an earthquake, some roads are blocked off, and their task is to rescue as many people as possible. And there are numbers of people at different sites and which roads are blocked off. So they're working together over the same map. And all of the action is on the map. They're talking, but they aren't looking at each other. And the talk is annotating their gestures, their route on the map. It's not that the gestures are ancillary or random appendages. The gestures are doing the work of the collaboration, and they amend each other's paths, again, using gestures. They alternate the way you alternate speech. They don't interrupt each other's gestures. We compared, and then they had to create a map, draw a map. And we compared their comparison to a pair that had a shower curtain between them, so they can speak and understand each other, but they can gesture on their own map, but they can't see each other's gestures. And the maps of the people that could see each other's gestures were much better than more accurate than the maps of the people that were sitting side by side. So those sitting side by side thought they had come to agreement on the route. And you would think spatial language would be better than language about other things because there's a way to verify it. But in fact, 30% of the maps that they thought they had agreed on differed. So that even spatial, not even, if you study spatial language, you pick up the ambiguities everywhere. But we're not often confronted with them. So gestures improve collaboration because part of our thinking is gestures on external representation. Okay. And here you think fast-moving basketball, where are the words? I mean, good players are reading the intentions of other players. They're communicating to their own team and hiding their communications from the other team. All of this is happening in split seconds. You can't describe it. You couldn't speak it. It's all really fast and nonverbal. Words with, okay. So I've talked to you a little bit about gestures for ourselves and that they help ourselves. In some of the experiments, we actually made people sit on their hands, and then they performed worse sitting on their hands. And some of them spontaneously pulled out their hands and said, I can't think without my hands. So they needed that support of their hands, and you can try it. Sit on your hands and explain to someone how to get to your house from the railroad station. And people get flummoxed. These again are real experiments that Bob Krause ran years ago. So a lot of people, Susan Golden Medal especially among them, have looked at gestures for others and do they communicate? And for a long time, linguists dismissed gestures. You can't codify them. They don't fit Chomsky. They don't. So they dismissed them as just hand waving. But it turns out they make a big difference. And if you don't see someone gesture, you miss a lot of the talk. But by now, there have been experiments showing what gestures help when. So what we studied is gestures for action. So action is particularly hard to understand from diagrams because they're static. You can get route maps and so forth from them. Animations were one cure for that people have used and loved because computer scientists love animations and people love animation. They're fun to look at, but it turns out that most of them for explaining scientific or mathematical processes don't work better than static graphics. And the reason is probably you don't focus on where the change is, so you might not even see it, but also showing isn't explaining. So it doesn't, we watched animations in our lives, but we don't know why the rain falls and cloud forms. So we watch those things happen, but they don't they don't come with an explanation. So gestures are active. They are animations of sort, and they should be uniquely important for conveying action. So we did a study examining that. So students watched, again, I was in an ed school, so the material has to be educational or education related. So students watched a video explanation of how a car engine looks, and half saw gestures that indicated the shapes of the parts, something about the parts. Half watched gestures that only showed action. So the carburetor goes up and down, or there's an explosion in the carburetor. So the gestures were timed equally well in both videos, and the same person did them. So half saw action gestures, half saw these structure gestures. We didn't expect much of an effect for the structure ones. We did hope for an effect for the action ones. So, and we had tests afterward, true false, on action and on structure. And those who saw the action gestures did better on the action statements, even though you didn't need to see any gestures to perform well on the action gestures, and on the action questions, from the narrative. You could have answered those questions. Nevertheless, those who saw action gestures did better. But what was even more impressive is afterward, we asked them to create a visual explanation of the end of how the car engine works. And there the action gestures had a huge effect. I'll show you. And we also asked them to make a video explaining to someone else how the car engine worked. So I can show you the gestures. That's a structural gesture, the shape. Go to the next slide, there. And this is an action gesture, an explosion. And the carburetor going up and down. Okay. So I just told you the results that action gestures had a huge effect on the visual explanation. The people that saw action gestures used more action gestures in their videos, and they even more than what they had seen, and their own gestures weren't copies of what they had seen. They were new inventions. So they were invented, not imitated. Those who saw the action gestures used more action words in their video explanations. They hadn't heard more action words, but they used more. So seeing those simple action gestures instilled in them a much deeper understanding of the action. Here are diagrams, visual explanations of someone who saw structural gestures. Here's another one. Here's action gestures. So they're showing the 5 stages much better than those who saw the structural ones. They're giving you a step by step. They're using way more arrows. We could count arrows. You didn't see any arrows in the other ones. There aren't, but there are tons of arrows in those that saw action gesture. You see the explosion. You see the bubbles from the oxygen mixing with the. So they really got it. I mean, you could look at this diagram and see they understood, and you can understand. So here's another one, again, way more arrows. What's so much fun about collecting these diagrams is the imagination of the students. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you. Gestures communicate, especially action ones, but certainly for good directions they communicate. So, and I'm telling you only a few of many experiments, but yet using gesture and graphics increase comprehension and learning for self and others. You can think of graphics as frozen gestures. They stay around and you can scrutinize them and study them. Gestures are fleeting. You can't recapitulate them. But as you've seen, they're especially appropriate and effective for conveying action. So lines, I mean, you saw the paths that people make in representing routes. So I've been obsessed by lines. This is Steinberg, and I'm very, I love his diagrams, conceptual diagrams. So there are lines created by the mind, there are lines created in the world, and lines created by the hand. So the eye is especially prone to seeing lines. We see lines where there are none. Okay, the Kanisa figure, which I hope most of you can see, a rectangle. The Mooney figures connecting here are harder. Who sees that? No, okay, about half. I think that's par for the course, and it's a guy riding a horse. So these, I lose it when I get too close. but you can see the legs of the horse and the riders, they are curved up and the head of the horse is there and these are the feet. It's a little hard to see, but it is so, it's easier to make lines with a Kanisa figure, but our visual system is after contours and it completes contours that are incomplete. So you'll see a whole hand behind the other hand. So we're because, and probably because contours give you objects, and it's important to distinguish and recognize objects. There are lines in the world. Trees are growing near a river. There are paths in the world, lines that we make in the world that are paths in the world. There are the hand draws lines, and this is Escher, and we have Steinberg. I don't know if you have this children's book. It's a wonderful book of Harold. It's Harold in the Purple Crayon in English. It's meant for 3, 4, and he draws his world and then lives in it. So at some point he draws an apple tree, and he doesn't want anyone to steal apples. So he creates a dragon that is going to guard the apple tree. And then his hand trembles because he's getting afraid of the dragon. So his hand is doing this, and then he drops into the sea. Those become waves. So the lines keep changing meaning throughout the story. And I can tell you empirically, 3-year-olds get it and laugh. Okay. Lines make boundaries. So they don't just connect one landmark to another, they also cut off. You can't go any farther, right? So they make boundaries. Lines have lots of meaning. And then we use it metaphorically. You know, anyone who's in therapy will tell you they need to set boundaries, right? So, lines have many meanings. This is again Steinberg. It's a huge graphic that takes up a wall even bigger than this one. I've seen it in galleries. Here's Steinberg drawing, Grand Canal, clothesline, the sidewalk from above, the Nile, the top of a railroad bridge, the table, the ceiling. So you effortlessly understand the meanings of those changing lines. And as Clay famously said, a line is a dot that went for a walk. So our hands make lines both in gestures and in drawings. So I'm going to switch now to talking more about graphics. And they seem to have a kind of limited, not limited, but they have a vocabulary. So graphics and gesture can use icons, some representations of things. So you can say fish, the big fish I caught. You can describe it, and we have lots of videos where people are making houses and that sort of thing with gestures things. But you can point, these are the abstractions that gestures make. And gestures, because it's hard to make icons, they almost necessarily abstract gestures. You're putting on the one hand, on the other hand, and later you can use those spaces you've created on the one hand and the other hand to continue the arguments. I've set up this space as with my gestures, and I can keep adding to each space. So graphics in particular, but also gestures are combined by icons, points, lines, arrows, and container-like things, boxes, container-like things. So we looked at these meanings in a set of experiments that you could call empirical semantics. So we're having people create graphics, other people understand them, and we're seeing if they map onto each other. So a minimal diagram would be a link between 2 points, and points on the whole are used to represent places. things, ideas. So again, in the real world, if I'm marking a place, I'm taking up an area on the ground. This is where my house is, and this is where the railroad station is. They're all represented as points. And they're gonna be point-like in the real world. So points can represent places, things, and ideas, and lines are connections between them, any relation between them. So that's a minimal diagram or a minimal graphic, the way you can think of a proposition as a meaning, as a minimal expression of meaning. And we can make forms out of them, lines, crosses, arrows, and blobs, and their meanings are related to their mathematical or gestalt properties, but context depends, specific. So we've studied bars and lines and graphs with Jeff Zaks, curves, lines, crosses, and blobs in route maps with Paul Lee, arrows in mechanical diagrams with Julie Heiser, circles in cycles with Angela Kessa. I won't talk about that. I can do that offline. So Paul Lee and I asked people, we caught students in a dormitory just before dinner and asked them to tell us how to get to a nearby Taco Bell fast food place, if they knew it. And we asked half to make diagrams, maps, and half to make verbal descriptions, tell us how to get there. So the maps on the whole look like this. I only have one example. So maps could be analog. They aren't. The distances aren't real. This is a long distance. These are short ones, and they exaggerate where there are lots of turns and where you have to know the information. So they're not vertical at all. They don't get the correct lineup of the streets. They make things right angles that aren't right angles. On the whole, they represent straight paths, curved paths, and landmarks, in this case, roads. But again, the vocabulary is minimal. Oh, I don't have it here. Sorry. And the descriptions are similar. Now you expect descriptions to be schematic, but they're schematic in the same way the maps are. So turns are take a turn, make a turn. Nobody indicates degrees, just as these don't, and they're wrong. And so the maps they're making are schematizing the environments in the same way that language is. And in fact, we could map one on the other. There was the same vocabulary, and we could go back and forth between them. So not everything that we want to represent has a simple constrained vocabulary, but many have something approaching to it. So these are experiments that Jeff Zaks and I did. We gave people one of these, not both, and we asked them to describe in a sentence what's shown in the graph. And what we expected, so bars is separate. They give you piles and they separate. So we expected discrete comparisons from the bars, but lines are continuous. They show you that there are two variables that differ in their actual value, but they're related on a dimension. So we expected continuous descriptions from the lines and discrete ones from the bars. And in fact, that's what we got. And when we asked people to draw something to represent something discrete, we got bars. And if we represented a relation, we got lines. And this even went against the underlying variable. So the visual or verbal were dominating. And again, you could go back and forth between lines and bars. Arrows. So arrows are a little, I mean, we have lines in the world, as I said, and not like things in the world. Arrows, do we have them in the world? Well, we have the arrows that get shot and that get released from a bow and arrow, and they do fly in the direction the arrow is pointing. We have erosion that gives us arrows, but the argument that arrows are in the world is a little weaker. It's so weak. In this case, Julie and I gave people, again, one of these diagrams, either with arrows or without. And we asked them to describe what was going on. If they had no arrows, we got structural descriptions. They told us what this thing looked like, where the parts were in relation to each other. If we put in arrows, they gave us the process. They told us what happened from beginning to end. You push down on the the bicycle pump and it forces air into the tube, and then the air goes into the tire. So they gave us step-by-step linear descriptions of the process if there were arrows, and they gave us structural descriptions without them. So that simple arrow communicated a huge amount. And we did the reverse. We gave descriptions that were step by step, asked for a diagram, or we described the structure, completely different diagrams they drew. So what's this? I mean, this is an arrow that people made, right? On the ground. So there was a helicopter in the skies, and there was a theft. And the car that was fleeing because it had done the theft was not visible. The helicopter people couldn't find it. So the people on the ground formed an arrow to tell the helicopter driver where to find the thieves. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about very clean diagrams, ones that are explicit and meant to explain a process or meant to explain a rule. And we want those to be very clear, but there are cases where we want messy ones. This is Frank Gehry. He hands this to a contractor. What am I supposed to build? Right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but these are his initial ideas. I've got Leonardo, these are ones so lines are used for design. And we studied architects making sketches. This is Masaki Suwa, and later we worked with a couple of other people, but most of the work was Masaki Suwa. We challenged a dozen or so architects some were newly minted architects just coming out of architecture school, and some were very experienced architects. And we asked them to make a museum on a hillside, to design a museum on a hillside, and they sketched because that's their medium. And we asked them to talk about what they were doing while they were sketching. They could either sketch or they could talk. They couldn't do both. And their thinking isn't in words. So that's a good reason why they can't. The thinking is a conversation between the eye and the hand and the page. They sort of know what their hand will do, but they don't really know until it's out there. And in fact, they make discoveries in their own sketches. They sketch for one reason, and they look at the sketch. As I said, the mind is too small. So you put the mind in the world, it expands the mind, and you see things you didn't intend. I mean, we all do this with data. You know, we look at the data, we see things we didn't anticipate, and if we're pre-registered, how am I going to do this? And that's the constraints of pre-registration is the exploratory data, which is what we love, is a little bit problematic. So our architects would do this, and it was a productive cycle. And the more experienced architects did it better, so they could make inferences that weren't in the sketch. And this is a bit like chess players. You know, look at the same board, and the experienced ones see things that inexperienced music scores. People who know music can hear things that the rest of us can't. So the experienced architects are making more inferences and more abstract inferences from their own sketches. So they could see things like the traffic's going to be a mess. They could see things like the light is going to fall badly in the winter. So that's not here. You have to make inferences from the sketch. And our less experienced architects could only make these perceptual inferences of seeing maybe there's a triangle here and maybe that's a motif, I'll exaggerate it. So they could only look at the visual, perceptual as it was. They couldn't make these leaps that the experienced architects. So what enables those leaps is the ambiguity. It can be reinterpreted, and I'll talk about artists who do that even more. So in messy graphics, the ambiguity promotes discovery. I mean, we know that from music, from art, from poetry, that every time we experience them, we see new things. That's the beauty of great art, is you look at it again, and gee, I didn't see that, or gee, what does, and you see new things, often more abstract. So Masaki and I call this process constructive perception, using perception in the service of cognition, which the designers are doing, and we brought it into the laboratory, and I'm gonna skip the experiments on that, but they're there somewhere. So one of my graduate students is a very accomplished artist and now an art educator who's bringing cognition and perception into art education. And she's doing it in the form of graphic books. Her dissertation she hand drew, including inventing ways to show data that were very clever. So it's a beautiful book. Some of it she published, so it's around. And the artists too talk about it as the conversation between the eyes and the hand and the page. And Andrea, the student, was sure the artists could talk about their work as they were doing it. They couldn't either. And she's someone who draws and paints, and she didn't realize talk gets in the way. So she did what Masaki and I did. She videoed them, and afterwards showed them the video. And what I neglected to say with Masaki is we asked them what they were thinking with everything that they drew, and that corpus still exists and has been used and reused. So artists have a similar reaction. They say their ideas emerge from the page. They don't know where they came from. So these are some of the things that they say about drawing. It's a melange for many of them. Drawing is creating something from nothing. Drawing enters other worlds. You create a world and then you play with it. Drawing gets life of its own. Drawing turns into other drawings. Drawing drives itself. Drawing is exploration, finding things, discovery. It focuses attention, engages, it calms. Drawing is fun, playful, safe. So these are, again, ways that promote their own creativity and their own drawings. Kentridge, if he's an artist you're not familiar with, find his art on YouTube, okay? He's, I think, probably arguably with Gerhard Richter, the best living artist in the world. He's just remarkable. And he makes animations, there's these stop animations, he makes them with charcoal. He early on said, I'm no good at color. He makes drawings with charcoal, photographs them, changes the drawing, photographs, changes photographs. So he ends up with lots of visual metaphors where tears turn into lakes and the tape coming out of an adding machine turns into a migrating path. He makes absolutely astounding visual metaphors that change that way. And Kendrick is also, he writes poetry, he acts, he directs, he produces, he's phenomenal. If he's doing anything anywhere near here, run, get a ticket. So he says, I can think with charcoal in his hand. I can't think with paint. Charcoal makes lines. And he talks about thinking. Drawing makes thought visible. Or drawing, here I'm quoting him. Drawing makes visible the way we are in the world, both the way we think and the way we move through the world, which is provisional, changing, constructed out of incoherent fragments into a seemingly coherent subjectivity, consciousness. Drawing is slow motion version of thought. So what he's describing is thinking. It's not just drawing. It's doubting, leaping, excavating, waiting, and irrevocably split. It's a multi-layered highway of consciousness where one lane has one thought, but driving up behind it and overtaking it is a completely different thought. I draw the way I think, but I think he's describing thinking. Okay, so now we're going to go ancient. When my kids were small, on vacations, instead of taking them to resorts or Disneyland, I took them to caves. I forced my own passion. This was long before I thought to do. Took them to antiquities. They went to Egypt. We went to the pyramids in Mesoamerica. We went to caves in France and Spain. This is what I did. These are petroglyphs in Utah. And you see what they're drawing, animals and people. And you see these could be anywhere in the world. Those people with bows and arrows, you find them anywhere in the world. Animals, this is currently the oldest cave art. They keep discovering older ones for 40,000 years, Sulawesi. And there are detectable animals there. There are hands, and you find hands. We found them in Mexico in caves. You find hands everywhere, and I think they're a little bit like I was there. Right? I leave my handprint. If you go to Egypt, you can see a graffiti on one of the temples of what's the name of the guy who couldn't translate as a hieroglyphics. He left his graffiti in Egypt on a temple, his name. Before you had writing, you left your hand. This is the former oldest map. I told you there are new discoveries all the time. This is after writing. Most of these things came long before writing. And this is Babylonia, but in several languages. But you see, it's a line, drawing lines. It's very schematic. It's mixing perspectives and mixing, well, I'll get to that. You mix perspectives all the time. Distances aren't right. It's very schematic. This is characteristic of maps from ancient time and maps in our head. This is now the oldest map. It's this big. It's a stone, 2 inches by 1 inch, so what, 8 centimeters by 3 centimeters. And it was found in a cave in Spain. Can you imagine going into a cave, picking up a rock, and seeing that it's a map? I mean, the thrill of a lifetime for an archaeologist. And if you pick up a little stone, you could completely discard it. Why would you pick it up? So that is a map, and it's a map of the region outside the cave. It's partly schematic and partly depictive. So the mountains are there, and there are horned creatures. Eskimo map, it's carved in wood. These are Greenland Eskimos. They canoe around the coast. So they're the coastline there, and they're reversible. And they fit in a mitten. It's cold. So they fit inside a mitten, and if you should drop it, they float. So maps come in all kinds of forms. South Sea Islanders, they went 2,000 miles on the ocean, open ocean, using these bamboos and sticks. So the bamboos are the ocean currents. You can think of them as the roads of the ocean. And the shells are islands. You can't see one from the other. I mean, imagine navigating in a small canoe with these things and seeing nothing but ocean. They were highly trained, the navigators, and at least some of them came back. So these are a valley in Italy, that Vedolina, that have dozens of these. Again, you see similarities. There are paths and there are cubes for the homes. So again, mixing perspective and using lines and paths. This is how Native Americans showed the northwest coast of America. They held up their hands and put the settlements on places in their hands. So we have ancient remnants showing people, animals, and spaces. Okay, now more animals. This is an event. So there's the stone, it was inscribed on. This is a drawing of what it looks like. It's 6,000 years ago in Kashmir, it was found. And an astronomer, there are two suns. What's going on? An astronomer determined that at that time, they could date the drawing. At that time, there was a supernova. So there was an explosion of a star that was bright as the sun. And that was so memorable, or that they engraved it on a stone. And that wasn't simple, so that's a single event. You get lots of multiple events. This is later in time, obviously. Why you would show bread making in a tomb, I don't know. But this is showing step by step how you make bread from sowing the wheat to grinding it to baking it. They're beautiful. Trajan columns showing the Roman conquest. Again, you can't see them on the ground, but there it is. The Bayeux Tapestry. This is a Chinese emperor's journey. Again, showing it on a map. Are you mixing the more realistic with the more conceptual? So time, we've shown events, representing events in many ways, and you see many old petroglyphs of hunts, of the bows and arrows and the animals everywhere. So they're also representing time, and some of it in linear kinds of ways that we use calendars, some cyclical. So that's another story, not for now. You also get primitive representations of number. There's no number, but there are tallies. And this is found in Lobos Cave in South Africa, 70 to 100,000 years ago. What the lines are indicating, if they're really a tally, we don't know. But you do find tallies, again, all over the world, tallies. Here's another African example, 22,000 years ago. So ancient graphics show people, animals, things, place, space, time, events, and number. These are obviously things important to humans. And that's why they're being depicted. And of course, the brain knows that too. And the brain has special places or special ways of representing each of these things. Modern graphics, same. There are people, animals, things, place, space, time, events, number. Of course, they show other things too, but those are really basic. So external representations like graphics, and how am I doing on time? Okay, how much more?
We have a 2-hour slot, so
Oh,
whatever's good for you.
that exhausts people's attention. So there's one set of things that I won't do unless there is demand. Oh, well, there's more than one, but one in particular. Um, so external representations, the stuff we put in the world, we use the space of the world to put our minds in. They're cognitive tools. They expand the mind. They facilitate information processing. You can't do multiply three numbers by three numbers without pencil and paper. Some of you probably can, but most of us can't. They convey information, communicate. They promote inferences, are architects and painters, and data. They enable new ideas. They facilitate collaboration. So there are multiple reasons for it. They make things, they are memory aids, right? Like photographs. So our thinking with sketches, gestures, thinking with other people, we do a lot of that. Thinking with things, that kind of thinking that you saw in the architects and the artists, and the people making gestures, that kind of thinking is intelligent. It's highly skilled. It's invisible unless you guys figure out a way of detailed mind reading. It's interactive. I'm looking at the sketch and thinking, looking at the sketch, I'm making gestures, thinking, revising the gestures. All of that is highly interactive. It's context bound. The meaning of a gesture like a line changes meaning the same way the line in a diagram does. It's not easily codable. I mean, words are really easy to code. And things like gestures aren't codable or are hard to code. And I showed you the best examples. Sketches are hard to encode, that you can't break them down to units that combine. I did say you could do that with sketch maps, but many those diagrams that Gary drew, you can't do it. So, and they're unique. This kind of thinking, the artists interacting with their own sketch, happens once, it's different the next day. It's unique. So none of this can provide a database to train an AI, or that's my contention now, and you can disagree with that, but it feels to me that these natural ways of expressing ourselves through gesture, through sketches, and our natural way of interacting with them and getting insight from them, are a real challenge for Gen AI. Okay, I'm winding down. This is the world nature gives us. More nature. This is the world that we create, we design. We design everything. It's hard to find anywhere on Earth that we have not designed in some way or another or controlled. I'm told that the weight of the things we built is huge. Venice is sinking under the weight of the buildings in Venice. So even the things we're constructing in the world are heavy. But within our house, we make categories, hierarchies, and orders in our books, in the supermarkets we shop in our shelves. So we're putting these abstract concepts, categories, hierarchies, and orders, we're putting our mind in the world, those abstractions of our mind. We're putting themes, not just categories. There's a long argument on children's development that categorization is supposed to be great and abstract, and themes are primitive. And, I'm going to fight against that. Our houses are organized by themes. Everything that has to do with preparing food is in the kitchen, comes from many different categories. Everything for relaxing is in the living room, many different categories. So themes are also important, and we put those out in the world. We have a theme right here. What is a classroom? we have one-to-one correspondences, repetition cycles, embeddings in our place settings. So again, an abstraction that's guiding our arrangements of space. We have it in our buildings. This is Padua. I recommend visiting. So that every room has its balcony and its colonnade and so forth. So those one-to-one correspondences, embeddings, hierarchies are in the buildings we create. They're there in 3D in the cities we construct. Then we take those arrangements that we've been doing forever. Another place you should go to is Ephesus and see what the Romans were building ages ago. It will wow you. So we've been doing that forever, building these, putting our minds into the world. And then we take those structures, the columns and rows, and make them into diagrams that are meant to communicate. This is not necessarily meant to communicate, it's meant to house people, get people from place to place. But even that, think of children growing up in this design world. How much abstract information they're getting from their surroundings. That when you were a hunter-gatherer and very little of the world was designed, you were coping with the world nature design, but there wasn't that content or quantity of information. It was a different kind of information. You had to recognize plants and recognize animals and learn your way. But these abstractions that we create and put in the world weren't there then. So you could argue the world is making us smart. And so then we use those rows and columns to create diagrams, to organize our abstract knowledge. This is arguably the most influential diagram in the world, the periodic table. We use it in frame tables, rows and columns. We use it in bar graphs. This is in jokes. This is the likelihood of a computer issue solved by reconfiguring something, reimagining antivirus software, uninstalling, that's the small stuff, or rebooting. This is how long it took me to draw and color each of the bubbles. There are bunches of those on that. Okay, so we use those configurations to communicate, and I bring this together in a concept I call abstraction. It's an ugly word. Latinate words are ugly, they sound technical. And so it's a contraction of space, action, and abstraction. So actions in space create abstractions. We're building our buildings. We're creating our sketches and diagrams. These are all actions we're taking in space that create abstractions. Those actions pile up, push, rearrange. They get turned into gestures, which are actions on thought. And the abstractions we create, rows and columns, turn into diagrams that we deliberately use to communicate. So there's a kind of cycle that links actions in space and gesture and abstraction, and they each feed on each other. We've not only put our minds into the world, we diagram the world. This is what an airport looks like from above. It's directions for each of the kinds of vehicles and the planes, nothing there for people. But this is the world we live in. We are living in a diagram. And that diagram is telling us what can move where, when they can move, how they can move. So it's constraining our movements and the movements of everything we built and the movements of the animals we raise. And it's also enabling it when we stop, when we go, but we are immersed in a diagram.